I work, primarily in photography and sculpture. And I'm originally from St. Paul, Minnesota. My background, I went to university for psychology. So I've always kind of had an interest in kind of like the subconscious and the mind and things that we're not aware of that kind of control our lives to some extent. So that interest initially brought me to psychology, and it kind of has currently brought me to investigating kind of the same topics through my art. I spent most of the last decade in New York City doing fashion photography as well as some of my own art stuff. And recently I now split my time between Bangkok and New York, and I focus all my energy on doing fine art now. So that's a little bit of background about my photography and kind of how I got to where I am. I first started doing photography after I graduated college. I moved into a place where there was a darkroom, and so I thought it was a perfect opportunity to try out photography because it was something I wanted to do, and it kind of changed my life. The rest is history. I it started doing film and analog stuff, and moved into digital when the time came, and enjoyed it very much, and I find it to be a really interesting way to try to express kind of like interior states, things that photography was not initially set up to document. So I find it to be kind of a really interesting medium to try to do the type of work that I do, and I find it to be both a big challenge but also like extremely rewarding. So the concept of the exhibition is, it's called The Void. It comes from a French phrase, l'appel du vide, which basically talks about when you're up somewhere high and you peer over an edge and you kind of feel this weird like bit of a pull towards the edge, and obviously a pull back. And I basically make an analogy to that call of the void with the psychological version. And the psychological version is maybe a bit different and a bit more complex. So obviously if you answer that call of the void, you just die and it's over. But the psychological one, what I'm talking about is kind of a cycle of kind of like death and rebirth. Mm-hmm. So the call isn't like in my mind, the call isn't an absolute call to your own like demise, at least from a psychological standpoint, but rather the death part of it is an essential part of our ability to change. So if we're going to change as people, we have to be able to move on from who we were and what we're attached to and kind of our current state to get into a new place, like a new state. So like the self, and the self being kind of your idea about who you are right now and who you've been. That in psychology terms we call the self. But we think of it as kind of a static thing. But it's not a static thing. It's actually everything around you is changing all the time, and you're changing too. And our minds try to create this sense of continuity from one moment to the next, and this static idea about ourselves that we are this one being that's moving through time, and that we're not exactly changing, or we're just changing a little. But I think a better, more interesting way to like understand it is actually to think of it as we're constantly kind of dying and being reborn. We're constantly kind of, parts of us are being like destroyed and renewed, and it's actually like a process of continual death and rebirth. And it's a good way to think about it for a couple of reasons. One is I think it acknowledges that there's a difficult and like painful component to like changing. I think people, certainly from the U.S. culturally, we like to think of like always like ascending upwards and things just getting better, but there's always a cost. As we change, there's always a cost. And so thinking of it as a death and a rebirth, it kind of brings into focus this idea that change is difficult and change is painful. And so it's important to acknowledge that to move forward. You can't really deny that component of things and hope to be able to kind of meet the change that you need to meet, So the call of the void is basically that subconscious call for reinvention. But the difficult part, the reason that some of the images are difficult in the exhibition is because to get to the rebirth, you have to first pass through the death part. So, and then that kind of ties into the whole KG plus Kyotography idea of this like cycle of life, because if you think of it, it's much the same as kind of a cycle of life, except rather than think of it as like, living creatures like dying and being reborn exactly. It's kind of thinking of yourself as being subject to that exact same cycle, except it doesn't happen once. It's happening continuously. You're continuously dying and being reborn. And we all try to make sense of this in our own sort of way. So this is kind of like my way of kind of examining it and trying to make sense of it. And I think it actually fits the work really well, because it's converted from a former home. And really, like most of the dramas that we experience, most of the things that I'm talking about, they happen like in the home. Like this is where people lived, and really what my work is like looking at is kind of lived experiences. And so, to have like all the people's dreams, happen here, and all the little struggles and everything else, they all actually physically happen in this space. There's been a house for like more than 100 years. So generations have gone through kind of like the stories that are present in these things in their own sort of way. So in that way, I think it provides like kind of the perfect space to bring this up, because this is the space that people actually encounter these kind of challenges and encounter this part of reality. So I think it makes sense in terms of an analogy when you go through this space to like think about the work in terms of that, but I also think it makes sense just purely kind of like on an emotional level, where people can kind of, in this space, I think they'll feel a little more at home. And when they feel a little more at home, I think it evokes feelings of some, struggle. There's always struggle at home. Nobody survives growing up without like a little bit of struggle. So I think being in this space is actually essential for helping people to connect to the work. I think it gets people halfway there already, so that they're in the right kind of place to really like feel and understand the work at a deep level. But then the KG plus part of it is, I feel like it's a kind of like a interesting like forum where people can are trying out kind of like new ideas and talking about kind of like contemporary understandings of photography, and there's like a wide type, or like a wide array of different types of artists investigating different processes and kind of like exploring the world from really like different points of view. But for whatever reason, it still feels like relatively like cohesive. Like the stuff that's been selected still feels like relatively cohesive to kind of like the central theme. So, I mean, it fits into the broader context of like contemporary photography and like fine art, in that it provides kind of like a specific forum in a specific place, like at a specific time, like a little snapshot of like what's going on in the larger world of art. What's going on in terms of like people's understanding of the world around them, and how is that kind of affecting people's lives. And that's a very important thing.